So the second workshop I taught for the future leaders of tomorrow was about the Powell principles. Now, if you don't know who Colin Powell was, he was the first African American Secretary of State. He was a four-star general and the first African American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He also authored, in addition to the Powell principles, the Powell Doctrine, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. So I think one thing that's kind of interesting when we look at Powell is how relevant are these principles today? How much do they hold? And how much should they dictate what leaders do today? So the way that I put his principles were under different categories that I think are applicable today. So one of his categories is really around emotional regulation. He says things like, get mad, get over it. It'll be better in the morning, etc. So it made me really think about Viktor Frankl, who used to say, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space, you have the power to choose your response, and in your response lies your growth and your freedom. So, really, about the importance of emotional self regulation and measuring your reactions and circumstances, which often takes time to figure out how you respond and not react immediately, which we often do when our amygdala is hijacked if there's fear or threat, change, etc. The second category is really around choosing hope. And I really thought about Jacinda Ardern, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, as really the emblem of this. He says things like, it ain't as bad as you think, or perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. I love that one. Perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. I uh, I really like the term grounded optimism. It's the idea that you have to, as a leader, be able to give people hope. It doesn't mean that you should deny what's happening or obscure what's happening or pretend that everything is okay when it's not. If there's going to be layoffs, you have to be able to say that there's going to be layoffs. With regards to layoffs, though, it is really important that we acknowledge the grief that people go through when there are layoffs within a company. People are grieving the loss of their colleagues, they're grieving the people that were beside them, helping them every day. They're grieving their old work of what they used to do, and maybe they have an entirely new portfolio. And often they're consumed and they have now picked up a lot more work than they had because companies are cutting back and thinking, how can we do more with less people? And wrongly thinking that AI is going to pick up a lot of the slack, where AI is incredibly helpful, but it is largely imperfect and must have a human AI interface to be able to actually produce good work. So we can't also minimize, when we have grounded optimism, the impact of things like layoffs or things happening in politics and the impact that that does have on our organizations. And I've actually been doing a lot of workshops lately on resilience, on post-traumatic growth, on anti-fragility, on meaningful connections and rebuilding connections and trust after there are things like a layoff or departure of a senior executive that was unexpected, because there is healing that needs to happen there. And often it's glazed over as if everything's perfect and it's not. Layoffs. But you still have to provide kind of the light at the end of the tunnel, where it is that we're going, what we do have to look forward to, or the grand vision of where that we're headed, so that you're giving people hope to get to that place, but not in a place that feels like you don't know what's going on, which is unrealistic. For example, I remember somebody who, a senior executive I worked with, who tended to really inflate the numbers of what he thought he could raise, which I thought was very idealistic, but it wasn't really grounded. It wasn't practical. So the board loved it until he didn't raise those numbers, and then it wasn't good, and the board didn't like it anymore because he wasn't raising the numbers. So it is important to be transparent as much as you can. The third category is setting a North Star, having a vision. So Colin Powell says that we have to have a vision. And again, that's about really setting that vision for the future. And I think North Stars are also about talking about the we instead of the me and the you. Like, how do we get to this North Star? And what are each of your roles in getting to that North Star? So you're exciting people, you're giving them hope, you're getting them motivated because they're saying you are actually part of this path to achieve this North Star. But you have to show them what that North Star is. You have to have that vision, such as I used Nelson Mandela as an example, what South Africa would be after apartheid ended, what his vision was for a future that was integrated between blacks and whites, and how that would actually empower the country to have a much better future than it did for everybody, and really inspiring people to strive towards that vision. The next one is really about perseverance. And he says, don't take counsel of your fears or your naysayers. I really thought about Kamala Harris. She said, don't let people tell you who you are. You tell them who you are. This was her mother that said that to her. I also love the quote, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And that is frequently attributed to Gandhi, but it was actually a labor organizer in the US. The next category is really around collaboration and kindness. He says, share credit, be kind. These aren't hard, right? So I thought about Greta Thunberg in this example of she was always sharing credit with people. If someone asked her a question on stage, she would say, why are you asking me? Why don't you ask other people around me, right? Having that humility to not take credit for everything and knowing that it really makes people feel good. And when they feel, again, my leadership lesson, feel appreciated, valued, recognized, and heard, they're way more motivated to act. The next category is about accountability. And this really reminded me of my favorite Doug Conant, who says, be tender-hearted with people, but be tough-minded with results, and that you can do both. And he says, be demanding and check small things. That's Colin Powell who says that. And then the last one is really about responsibility and decision making. He says, don't let adverse facts stand in the way of a good decision. You can't make someone else's choices. You shouldn't let someone else make yours. And avoid having your ego so close to your position that when your position falls, your ego goes with it. So the irony, of course, and the controversy over this, which is detailed more in my video about Iran, is that Colin Powell also authored the Powell Doctrine, which kind of built upon some of these things. So, basically taking responsibility for your actions and making sure that your ego isn't tied to your position, making your own choices, etc. And as we remember from the Iran video, the Powell Doctrine has to do with when do we intervene militarily? Is there a vital national interest, a clear objective? Have we done the risk? What are the consequences? Is there internal public support and international public support, a clear exit strategy, etc.? And the irony with Colin Powell is that he actually gave this famous speech in front of the UN Security Council, hoping that they would vote on a resolution to basically make the war okay in Iraq, and they ended up not doing it. But he is very famous for being the front man who stood up on that stage and did that, even though that kind of went against some of his leadership principles and things within the Powell Doctrine. Hope this was a good leadership lesson for you on the Powell principles, and I would love to hear how relevant do you think these principles are today. And again, if you're interested in having me come in and facilitate and talk to your teams about the Powell Doctrine, the Powell principles, how do they relate to the day? What are your principles as an organization and as a team that, I often say there's often values, but values are tied to principles and those are tied to behaviors. And if you cannot identify how the values translate to principles and behaviors, you essentially have no values as an organization because they're not being implemented by anyone because they don't know what they are. So that's a lot of our work sometimes is going in and figuring out what are the values that you claim to have? Are those the right values? Are people in line with those? How do those translate into principles? And then how do those principles translate into behaviors at each level of the organization? I'll put my email at the end of this, but feel free to DM me and would love to hear what you think about the Powell principles and the Powell Doctrine.